anyway, Tim asked me if I had any familiarity with your congregation, and I just grinned because there are so many longtime friends and dear friends sitting in this room. Some of you, probably very few of you know that I'm actually a preacher's kid myself. Not from a UU congregation, though. So standing up in front of a church congregation is a very familiar thing to me. And I appreciate being asked. Y'all did an amazing job of putting together readings and the songs and all of that go so well with what I want to talk about today. I was annotating everything in my mind as we went through. And sadly, I'm not going to have a chance to share those annotations with you all because there's too much to talk about and too little time to do that in. But know, and I'm going to encourage you to think about the connections between what I'm going to talk about and the music and the readings, including all those great quotes that Tim found. So I want to talk about water, humans, and Great Salt Lake, relationships of change. I'm not going to embarrass y'all by asking how many of you all have ever been to Great Salt Lake, because that can be a pretty embarrassing question in northern Utah, even though we live right here. I will tell on myself, though. I moved to Ogden, Utah in 1978, and I didn't ever visit the lake until nearly 20 years later. I have known Bev Dally way longer than I have known Great Salt Lake. Terry Tempest Williams' book, Refuge, was my introduction to what's become a very interesting and very interested relationship for me with Great Salt Lake. I'm a sociologist, so that's actually the thing that interests me scientifically, is the relationships between humans and Great Salt Lake. It turns out that our relationships with the lake have always been about change and adaptation. We affect the lake affects us, but the fact that both sides continue to adapt does not mean that things are okay, and we need to be aware of that. It's a very cool and very important lake that we locals tend to take for granted, but it turns out that we have a very vested interest in the health of Great Salt Lake. It can affect our own health in a number of ways. Okay, so some quick basics, just because there are often folks who don't know some of the basic things about the lake that are important to have in mind as we have this conversation. So Great Salt Lake is a very shallow terminal lake. Terminal meaning there are no outlets. Water's only exit is through evaporation. So when the reading or when the meditation took us to that place of going off to the ocean, well, if you're in Great Salt Lake, if you're watering Great Salt Lake, you don't make that part of the journey, okay? Just, we have to keep that in mind, okay? But that's why it's salty, because rivers and springs bring minerals in, but because the water doesn't flow through, those minerals collect there in the lake. On an annual basis, the elevation increases with some spring runoff and then shrinks again under the summer sun. Wet years can lead to net gains, dry years to net losses in lake elevation. But it's really shallow, and this is a really important thing for us to keep in mind. Great Salt Lake is at the bottom of a very shallow bowl. So it's more like pouring water onto a plate than into a cup, right? So relatively small changes up or down in elevation make for huge changes in size, okay? At its historical average, which we've now messed with enough that now we call it the common elevation of Great Salt Lake, because we've messed with the average so much. But at the common elevation of 4,200 feet above sea level, The lake is 75 miles long and 28 miles wide. Sometimes we don't know those numbers. That it covers, at that elevation, it covers 1,700 square miles. Okay? Pretty great lake, right? Well, in 1963, the lake hit its historic low of 4191. At that point, the lake covered only 950 square miles. Okay? So only 9 feet in elevation difference, only 9 feet in difference in elevation meant 750 square miles of reduced coverage, right? And there's just 9 feet difference between the average elevation and the historic low. 9 feet, keep that in mind, okay? Now, from 1986 through 1987, the lake hit its historic high. Some of y'all were around during those years. That high was 4211.85, so almost 4212, which at that elevation, the lake covered 2,300 square miles, well over twice the land cover from 1963. And that, of course, if you were here, you know this part, that led to $240 million in flood damage, okay? Which we learned from that. We adapted to the lake from that, and the FEMA floodplain maps all changed, and we put in place moratoriums so that now folks can't build as nearly as close to the lake as they had, and if they want to build that close, they have to bring in a bunch of fill, all of those kind of things. So that's part of that relationship. We have adapted to where the lake goes, but we also change the lake and where it goes. Now the lake fills a really key environmental niche. For example, 75% of all of our state's wetlands are affiliated with Great Salt Lake, with the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. 75% of our wetlands here in the whole state of Utah, okay? And plus, it's a hemispheric important place for several million migrating birds annually. It's also pretty useful for Utah economically. This is one of those things that a lot of people don't know about Great Salt Lake. Mineral extraction, so primarily the salts, the brine shrimp harvest, recreation, and other economic services that are provided by Great Salt Lake and its ecosystem bring in $1.32 billion annually to the state of Utah. $1.32 billion to the state. Now that includes $375 million in labor income alone, with 7,700 full and part-time jobs related to the lake annually, okay? So it's a pretty important lake, not only to its ecosystem, but also even to the economy of the state of Utah. Now, one other thing, though, for the last 15 years, Great Salt Lake's been low. Y'all probably noticed that, or maybe you haven't. You haven't noticed the lake when you've looked out at the islands. It's like, where's the water? And it's come really close to the historic low several times in the last 5 years, to the point that in 2016, people were saying, we're at that low, and other people were saying, well, not quite, but it's that close, okay? Now, we've all heard that drought is why, that at least drought plays a substantial part of that story, including due to the change in climate. But it's important to know that that is only part of the story. Drought is only part of the story of why Great Salt Lake has been so low. Really important research has shown that our diversions of water in northern Utah are diversions of water that would typically feed the lake, diversions primarily for agriculture but also other uses, have reduced the lake elevation by 11 feet. Okay, so there's that. Okay, so that's the lake stuff. What about we humans? Because that's that other side of that relationship. Well, you may have heard that the population of the state of Utah is on the increase, right? Between 2000 and 2010, we added more than 500,000 folks to our state population. That was nearly a 24% rise, okay? Now the population, you've probably all heard this because we keep saying it over and over and over. The population is projected to double between 2015 and 2065. Now, that matters to the lake in two ways. One way is that all those folks need places to live, okay? And the majority of that population increase is happening here in the Great Salt Lake Basin, okay? Now we're used to thinking about here on the Wasatch Front, but today I'm going to ask you to think about the Great Salt Lake Basin, okay? And turns out that here in the Great Salt Lake Basin, one of the only areas we have to grow, especially in Davis and Weber County, which are the counties that have populated areas close to the lake, pretty much the only place left to grow is ever closer to the lake, right? Out west. Tim's written some stories about that. Why do I know that? Because I've cited him. I've cited those stories. So that's one of the things, is that folks need places to live, and the closer we move towards the lake, in developing ever closer to the lake, that can encroach on the wetlands. It already is encroaching on the uplands that protect the wetlands. But it also means all those more folks, all those additional bodies, obviously also means that there are more folks who need water. Because, like we heard about in the reading, that's that one thing we can't live without, right? We can live without oil, we can live without gold, we can live without all that other stuff. But we can't live without water, and not just humans, right? Okay? Now, there's an ongoing debate here. Some folks argue that for that many more folks, we're going to need to develop more water. That even if we work hard at it, conservation just won't be enough. And if you think about it, that makes sense, because we're talking about a whole lot more folks, right? And you may be aware that the state is working toward eventually putting a dam on Bear River toward that end, to develop more water for all those more folks, okay? But others argue, because I said it was a debate, right? Others argue that Utah wastes a lot of water. And this is really true. That we're inefficient with how we use water, that there are lots of ways to reduce our water use in all sectors. And that's a really important piece. Now, particularly important is looking at agriculture here. 63% of all of the water that's used in the Great Salt Lake Basin goes to agriculture. And currently, both law and practice make conservation there really complicated, okay? But importantly, the estimate is that damming the Bear River would reduce water flow to Great Salt Lake enough to reduce the elevation another 8.5 inches, exposing another 30 square miles of lake bed. Okay. So, challenges for the future. My single biggest concern here Great Salt Lake's elevation is already low, already teetering on that historic low elevation. And it has been for the last decade and a half. And we know that diversions of Great Salt Lake's water sources are responsible for a substantial portion of that decline. The lake is already experiencing those reductions now. Before any additional increase in population, before any additional urbanization of the areas closest to the lake, or further development of lake-bound water, the lake is already struggling with very low elevation. In 2016, this number like blew me away completely. In 2016, 48% of the lake bed was dry and exposed. Almost half of the lake is already dry. Okay. And there are lake experts who argue that the lake's ecosystem can't afford any further impact on elevation. And yet, we haven't even talked about climate change, right? Which will not only affect Great Salt Lake's sources of water, it will also affect humans' sources of water, which will then further exacerbate these tensions over water, right? Now, increasingly low lake levels are problematic in many ways. Problems for the ecosystem due to increased salinity. The smaller the lake gets, it makes sense if you think about it, right? The more dense all those minerals get, right? So the salinity level increases. Plus the difficulties with the exposed lake bed in itself for the ecosystem, dried out wetlands, other issues, okay? And then if you think about what I talked about earlier, this starts also creating problems for Utah's economy, right? Because all of those things, those ecosystem problems, end up affecting the brine shrimp industry. They also, interestingly, even affect the salt extraction industry. I thought, yeah, they'll just love it if the lake's lower because the salinity goes up, but it actually complicates things for them and then ends up costing them a lot more money too. And then plus the recreation that the lake can support. And that's another one of those economic drivers from, economic benefits from the lake. But then importantly, the biggest human issue here is the increased risk for air quality problems from lake dust with increasing potential for health consequences. And yeah, that's something we all need in northern Utah, right? Is more air quality problems. So what to do? Yes, of course, conserve water. You all knew I was going to say that, but it turns out that's only a small part of what we need to do, okay? But yeah, conserve water wherever you can, especially water for outdoor use, because that's where we get most inefficient with our water use. In our high desert landscape, for example, overwatering Kentucky bluegrass, just saying. And we use far more outside our houses than we do inside our houses. So that's got to be one of the key places that we look. But that's not enough. That doesn't begin to be enough to address the problems at hand for the lake and for us. So that's a micro solution to a macro problem. We also need to focus on the macro. And here there's actually some good news, yay team. Some state and local policymakers and politicians are interested in these issues and are actually talking about it. And in fact, there were several pieces of legislation that were introduced in the 2019 legislative session. And we saw some increased support for working to sort out solutions, including funding important studies and working on a state water strategy. Okay, so that's good news. But there's lots of heavy lifting to do here. There are a lot of complexities here. So I'm just going to rattle off 3. There are a lot more than that, but 3. 1, there's no clear bad guys. Okay, I want you all to know that there are no clear bad guys here. Okay, it's way easier if there are bad guys to point at and focus on, but that's not the case here. Every stakeholder, everybody involved has really good reasons for doing what they're doing. So that's a complexity. Secondly, Great Salt Lake has been seen as a waste of water for a really long time, right? And it's tough to change perceptions, even when those perceptions have the potential to hurt we humans, just like the rest of the ecosystem, okay? So that's a complexity. And then third, and really importantly, some of the biggest inefficiencies of our water use are due to Western water law. So to create macro change, we really must change water law. Now, that may seem kind of pie in the sky, but it is being considered and sorted out and talked about in very serious and important ways by a whole lot of folks with a whole lot of clout. But it needs lots of support from folks who've done their homework. That would be you folks. That's where y'all come in. That's where that little handout, and by the way, a shout out to Heidi, because she made my information look really, really pretty, okay? So you're gonna find on here a whole lot of information about the lake. There's a bunch of reports on the back. Let me just mention really quickly that all of these reports that are listed on the back of this, each one of them has like a 1 to 2 page executive summary, so you don't have to read like 70 pages, okay? Y'all can deal with an executive summary. You'll also see at the bottom of the front page where you can find information on the current state of the lake at any given point. But then also really importantly, Friends of Great Salt Lake is the best place to keep track of not only what can we do in terms of advocacy, but what's going on, for example, politically, what's going on with research, what's going on that we can find out about and then sort out how to support, right? So that information is all in the handout. I didn't list anything for local action, but you can do your homework there too. So for example, think about local regulations about, say, green lawns. You know, if your community has those regulations, perhaps that's something we can work on as well, okay, and how that works, okay? So there's that. Now, to wrap up, one thing that I find really interesting, well, we humans attempted to manage Great Salt Lake during the crises for humans of the high elevation years, even spending $60 million to build the West Desert Pumping Plant project. Thus far, we've never attempted to manage problematically low elevation. Of course, with high elevation, we can focus on fixing the lake. But with low elevations, we have to focus on our own stuff, on humans, on our use, on our practices, right? I would argue that it's time to shift the focus. Now, you probably don't need me preaching about stewardship. Just as an aside, I was a little surprised when I saw the word sermon about my talk. I think my daddy rolled over in his grave when he said that. So, you know, I'm sure y'all don't need me preaching about stewardship. I'm preaching to the choir here, right? But that really is what it comes down to, taking care of what we've been entrusted with, right? Because taking care of just us, like our water needs, right, ends up leading to problems with justice, including for we humans, because we're part of that ecosystem too. right? But also for the whole rest of that ecosystem that we're a part of. That's what I have. Thanks a lot.